In the sterile glare of a military airport checkpoint, Meera Shaw, a 27-year-old woman with eyes that hold secrets too heavy for words, stands quietly as her life is unraveled. Her faded jeans and oversized hoodie mark her as just another traveler. But the worn dog tag hidden in her backpack tells a different story. One of courage, sacrifice, and a past erased by official records. When it slips free, clinking against the cold tile floor, the room falls silent, as if the weight of her hidden history could stop time itself. Declared dead after Operation Blue Ash, Meera carries a promise to deliver a letter from her fallen commander to his widow, a vow that has led her across continents. Why does she hide who she was? What truths are etched into that small piece of metal? Step into Meera's world, where quiet strength masks a story of heroism that could change everything. Meera Shaw, a seemingly ordinary woman, faces humiliation at a military checkpoint when her bag is searched, revealing a dog tag that silences the room. Declared dead after Operation Blue Ash, Meera hides her heroic past, saving 12 lives in a classified mission. Now she's on a mission to deliver a letter from her late commander to his widow, a promise kept across continents. Why does she conceal her identity? What secrets does the dog tag hold? As whispers of her return spread, Meera's quiet strength hints at a deeper, untold story that could change everything. Join us in celebrating quiet heroes like Meera. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more untold legacies that shape our world. Your support amplifies these powerful narratives. Leave a message for Meera in the comments. She might be listening. Together, let's honor those who serve in silence. Meera Shaw stood in the sterile glare of the military airport checkpoint, her faded jeans and oversized hoodie blending seamlessly with the crowd of contractors, military families, and government officials. At 27, she carried herself with the unassuming air of a civilian, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, its frayed straps and scuffed fabric hinting at countless journeys across continents. To the untrained eye, she was just another traveler, out of place in this high-security hub where every movement was tracked, every face scrutinized under the cold fluorescent lights. But beneath her plain exterior, Meera held a past she'd buried deep, a history that didn't match the quiet figure now shuffling toward the security scanner. Next, the bark came from Officer Rodriguez, a stocky man whose name tag gleamed with authority. His voice carried the weight of years spent processing travelers, each one blending into a monotonous blur of IDs and bags. Behind Meera, the line buzzed with low whispers. "Another civilian who thinks they can waltz through," someone muttered, their tone sharp with impatience. Meera stepped forward, her movements steady but deliberate, placing her backpack on the conveyor belt. A faint tremor in her fingers betrayed a flicker of nerves, though her face remained impassive. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked across the room in a quick, calculated sweep, noting the exits, the cameras, the faces of the security team. It was the instinct of someone trained to read a room for threats, not the casual glance of a weary traveler. When the metal detector screeched as she passed through, Rodriguez's expression shifted from boredom to irritation, his jaw tightening. "Step aside, miss, secondary screening." His tone was clipped, final. Meera didn't argue or hesitate. She nodded, her silence almost unsettling in its calm, and moved to the designated area. Most travelers would have bristled, demanded answers, or shown some spark of indignation. But Meera's composure was absolute, as if she'd faced far worse than a routine pat-down. Her stillness seemed to ripple through the checkpoint, drawing curious glances from the crowd behind her. Officer Martin, a burly man with a swagger that screamed petty authority, approached her backpack with a smirk. His badge caught the light as he grabbed the bag with deliberate roughness, unzipping it with a force that felt more theatrical than necessary. "Let's see what you're hiding," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. He upended the bun, spilling its contents onto the cold tile floor. A dented water bottle skidded to one side, followed by a crumpled pack of tissues, a dog-eared paperback, and a small first aid kit. The items scattered in a chaotic pile, each one a fragment of Meera's carefully guarded world, now laid bare for strangers to judge. Meera didn't flinch or blush, as most might have. Instead, she dropped to her knees with a quiet efficiency, her eyes scanning the mess, mentally mapping each item's position. Her hands moved with precision, gathering her belongings without blocking the flow of foot traffic. It was the reflex of someone trained to maintain order in chaos, to clean up a scene swiftly and silently. Her movements spoke of muscle memory, of years spent honing the ability to stay composed under pressure, to keep her focus sharp even when her dignity was under siege. As she reached for her things, a small, dull object slipped from the corner of her backpack, hitting the tile with a faint, unmistakable clink. A dog tag, its surface worn but distinct, gleamed faintly under the harsh lights. The room seemed to freeze. The hum of voices faded, the rustle of papers stilled, and even Martine's smirk wavered. The dog tag wasn't just a trinket. It carried a weight that silenced the checkpoint, a quiet testament to a past Meera had hidden beneath her unassuming clothes and guarded demeanor. For a heartbeat, Meera froze, her fingers hovering over the tag. Her face remained a mask, but her eyes, dark, haunted, and heavy with unspoken memories, betrayed a flicker of raw emotion. Not fear or shame, but the shadow of experiences she'd fought to bury. The crowd watched, some with curiosity, others with unease, as if they sensed the untold story behind that small piece of metal. Mira's gaze lifted briefly, meeting the eyes of those around her, and the quiet intensity in her expression made them shift back, almost instinctively. It wasn't defiance or anger, but the unshakable presence of someone who had survived horrors beyond the imagination of the impatient travelers watching her. The security cameras captured every moment, the way Mira's hands moved with practiced grace despite the humiliation, the way her breathing stayed steady even as her belongings were treated like trash, the way she held herself with a dignity that no amount of rough handling could erode. Rodriguez, still by the scanner, narrowed his eyes, sensing something off but unable to pinpoint it. Martine, recovering his bravado, scooped up the dog tag and held it up, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's this, huh? You playing soldier or something?" Mira didn't answer. She rose slowly, her movements fluid but deliberate, and extended her hand for the tag. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was control, forged in places far more dangerous than this checkpoint. In the booth above, a supervisor leaned closer to the monitor, their attention snagged by the scene below. The dog tag, the woman, the way she carried herself, it all hinted at something more than the civilian she appeared to be. Meera Shaw, a 27-year-old former sergeant, declared dead after Operation Blue Ash, stood in the heart of the checkpoint, her decorated past hidden but not forgotten, waiting for the moment to move forward. Meera Shaw, a 27-year-old woman with a peshtaas cloaked in shadows, stood at the military airport checkpoint, her unassuming presence belying the weight of her history. Once a decorated sergeant, she had been declared dead after Operation Blue Ash, her name erased from records to protect secrets she carried in silence. For 3 years, she had lived as a ghost, invisible to a world that had moved on without her. Now she was stepping back into that world, not for acclaim or validation, but to honor a promise made to a dying friend. In her worn backpack, she carried a letter and a service cap, relics of a life left behind, meant for a widow and a child who deserved closure. The security officers at the checkpoint, Rodriguez, Martine, and Thompson, saw only a quiet young woman, easy to dismiss. Officer Rodriguez, the lead, carried the weariness of a man hardened by years of routine, his authority unquestioned but tinged with cynicism. Martine, with his swagger and rough hands, handled Mira's belongings with a carelessness that bordered on disrespect, while Thompson, the youngest, eager to prove himself, mocked her possessions with a smirk. They rifled through her bag, scattering its contents across a metal table in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room designed to unsettle. A dog-eared romance novel, a well-used first aid kit, a faded photograph of soldiers. Each item was met with derision. "What's this? Pretending to be a medic?" Thompson taunted, holding up the kit. Martine, pacing, accused her of being a military groupie, chasing soldiers or peddling secrets. Their words were sharp, meant to provoke. But Mira's silence was her armor, her jaw tightening only slightly when Thompson mishandled the photograph of her former unit. Inside, Meera was a storm of restraint. She remembered the night that had defined her, the chaos of gunfire, the weight of wounded men she'd carried to safety, 12 lives saved at a cost she still paid. The accusations of these officers, so far from the truth, were almost laughable. but she held back, her mission too important for petty arguments. The dog tag slipped from her bag during the search caught Thompson's eye. "A souvenir from your boyfriend?" he mocked, unaware that it belonged to Captain James Rodriguez, Meera's fallen commander, whose final request had set her on this path. The room's dynamic shifted when Colonel Sarah Mitchell entered, her presence commanding respect. In her 50s, with a career forged in discipline, she recognized the dog tag immediately. Her eyes locked on Meera, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the officer's bravado. Taking the tag, she read the name, her expression softening with the weight of memory. She knew of Meera Shaw, the soldier who had vanished, presumed dead. "You're her," Mitchell whispered, a statement more than a question. The younger officers, confused, fell silent, sensing they had misjudged the woman before them. Mitchell returned the tag with care, her gaze conveying respect and a silent promise to keep Meera's secret. "You're clear," she said, dismissing her with a nod. Meera gathered her belongings and left the room, the weight of her purpose pulling her forward. Beyond the checkpoint, the airport hummed with oblivious travelers, unaware of the history walking among them. Meera's journey would end at a modest home where Maria Rodriguez lived with her 3-year-old son James, named for the father he would never know. Maria, hardened by loss but holding fast to hope, would receive the letter and cap, delivered by a woman who had carried them across continents. Meera didn't know how she would find the words to convey the depth of her promise, but she would stand in that doorway, fulfilling a vow to a man who had trusted her with his final wish, a debt of honor paid not for glory, but for love and remembrance. The air in the military airport checkpoint was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like damp heat. Meera Shaw stood silently, her posture rigid but her eyes distant, as if she were looking through the walls of the sterile room to a place no one else could see. Her backpack lay gutted on the floor, its contents strewn like the wreckage of a life she'd tried to keep hidden. Coins rolled lazily in arcs, a pen skittered to a stop, and loose papers fluttered like wounded birds. But it was the sharp, unmistakable clink of metal that sliced through the hum of the checkpoint. A single dog tag slid across the polished floor, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, coming to rest near Officer Martin's heavy boot. The room seemed to hold its breath. The dog tag, small and unassuming, commanded a silence so profound it felt like the world had paused. Martin, with his swagger and the smirk he'd worn like a badge all afternoon, crouched down to retrieve it. His fingers closed around the metal, and he held it up, his grin sharp and mocking. "Well, look at that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Probably picked it up at some surplus store, huh? Playing soldier?" But as his eyes traced the engraving, the smirk dissolved, wiped clean as if by an invisible hand. His face drained of color, first pale, then a sickly gray. His hand trembled, the tag quivering in his grip as he read the words again, certain he'd misread them the first time. Officer Thompson, younger and eager to prove himself, noticed the shift in his partner's demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with a curiosity and a hint of unease. Martin didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the dog tag, as if the words etched into it were rewriting reality itself. Thompson, impatient, snatched the tag from Martin's shaking hand. His own confidence crumbled as he read the inscription. "Shaw, M. May 2020. Op. Blue Ash. RN No 4. His expression mirrored Martin's, a cascade of emotions, from confusion to shock to something akin to dread. This can't be right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Martin finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse, like it had been dragged over gravel. "KIA means killed in action," he said, his training kicking in despite the tremor in his words. He looked at Meera, who had been silent for the past 20 minutes, her presence almost ghostly. "It means the person who wore this is supposed to be dead." Meera's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of a truth she'd carried for years. "That's what it means," she said simply, her eyes meeting theirs with a calm that felt like a storm held at bay. The silence that followed was heavy, not the empty void of before, but a living thing, swollen with implications neither officer was equipped to unravel. Just moments ago, they'd treated Meera's belongings with disdain, tossing her backpack's contents like trash, mocking the worn journal, the faded photograph, the small tokens of a life they couldn't begin to understand. They'd laughed, their voices sharp with arrogance, never imagining that among the scattered debris lay a piece of metal that held the weight of an entire history. A history of sacrifice, of loss, of a mission so classified its name was a whisper even among those with clearance. Operation Blue Ash. A name that meant nothing to most, but to those who knew, it was a wound that never healed. Martine's hand shook as he reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the button. "Control, this is checkpoint 7, he said, his voice unsteady. "We need a supervisor down here immediately." "Code Yellow." The words hung in the air, rare and ominous. Code Yellow wasn't just a call for help. It was an admission that they'd stumbled into something far beyond their pay grade, something that demanded answers from someone with the authority to ask the right questions. Thompson couldn't tear his eyes from the dog tag, as if staring at it might make it vanish, erasing the impossible truth it carried. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, Can you explain this?" He gestured vaguely at the tag, at her, at the chaos of her belongings scattered across the floor. Meera's gaze settled on him, her eyes carrying the weight of too many battles, too many losses. "What would you like me to explain, Officer Thompson?" she asked, her tone measured, but laced with a quiet challenge. "That the military makes mistakes? That sometimes people get left behind? Or that death certificates aren't always as final as they seem?" Before either officer could respond, the door swung open with a decisive creak, and Colonel Sarah Mitchell entered. In her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back tightly, in a presence that commanded every inch of the room, she was the embodiment of authority. Her uniform was immaculate, her stride purposeful, but her eyes held a sharpness that suggested she'd seen more than most could bear. "What's the situation?" she asked, her voice crisp, professional, cutting through the tension like a blade. Martine, still shaken, handed her the dog tag with a reverence he hadn't shown for anything else that day, as if it were fragile enough to shatter. Colonel Mitchell took it, her fingers steady, and glanced at the engraving. In an instant, her demeanor shifted. The military precision remained, but something deeper flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the shadow of grief. "Jesus," she whispered, the word escaping before she could catch it. She looked at Meera, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with unspoken history. "Sergeant Shaw," Colonel Mitchell said, her voice softer now, almost tentative. "Former Sergeant Shaw," Meera corrected, her tone quiet but firm. "Officially, I don't exist anymore." Colonel Mitchell set the dog tag down on the table with a care that bordered on reverence, as if it were more than metal, more than a marker of service. It was a relic, a testament to a sacrifice that should have been final but wasn't. She activated her comms, her voice steady but urgent. "This is Mitchell. I need a secure line to command now." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, one that carried the weight of questions no one dared ask. How could a single piece of metal hold the story of an entire unit's sacrifice? How could it mark a woman who stood before them, alive when every record said she should be dead? And what did it mean when the past refused to stay buried, when it walked into a checkpoint and demanded to be seen? Meera stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the dog tag, her thoughts a labyrinth of memories she'd tried to leave behind. The officers, still grappling with the implications, could only stare, their earlier mockery replaced by a dawning respect and fear of the woman they'd underestimated. The dog tag, small and unassuming, had rewritten the rules of their reality, and none of them would ever see Meera Shaw the same way again. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the sterile security room at the military airport checkpoint, casting stark shadows on the faces of those gathered. Meera Shaw, a 27-year-old woman with a quiet intensity in her dark eyes, stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture betraying years of military discipline despite her civilian attire. Her past as a decorated sergeant was a secret she guarded fiercely, buried beneath the official record that declared her dead after Operation Blue Ash. Across from her, Officer Rodriguez, the lead security officer, leaned against the desk, his authoritative demeanor tinged with the wariness of a man who'd seen too many travelers and too few answers. His colleague, Officer Martine, rifled through Meera's belongings with a rough swagger, tossing items carelessly as if to assert his dominance. Beside him, Officer Thompson, younger and eager to prove his worth, smirked at Meera's modest possessions, his mocking tone barely concealed. The tension in the room shifted when Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a career officer in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, entered. Her gaze locked onto the dog tag in Meera's file, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. She stepped to the side, pulling out her secure phone with practiced efficiency. "This is Mitchell," she said, her voice clipped. "I need the Blue Ash files pulled immediately. Authorization Charlie 77. She paused, her brow furrowing as she listened to the response. "I don't care if they're classified. Pull them now." An uneasy silence settled over the room as they waited. Martine and Thompson stood rigid, sensing they were caught in something far larger than a routine checkpoint inspection. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken questions. When Mitchell's phone buzzed again, she answered, her expression growing graver with each word. Hanging up, she turned to Meera, her eyes wide with something akin to reverence. "The official record states that Sergeant Meera Shaw died on November 15, 2020, during Operation Blue Ash," she said, her voice measured but laced with curiosity. "Posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Her body was never recovered." She studied Meera's face, searching for cracks in her stoic facade. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Meera's voice, when she spoke, was steady, but those who knew how to listen could hear the weight of memory woven into every syllable. "The whole story is classified, Colonel, even from you." "Then tell me what you can," Mitchell pressed, her tone softening but insistent. For a long moment, Meera said nothing, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the room's bare walls. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words spilled out. "November 15, 2020. My unit was tasked with providing drone support for a rescue operation in hostile territory. Intelligence told us we were extracting 3 captured personnel from an enemy compound. What they didn't tell us was that it was a trap." The room fell silent, the hum of the air conditioning fading into the background as Meera's words took hold. Even Martine stopped his restless pacing, and Thompson's smirk vanished. 12 of our people walked into that compound," Meera continued, her voice steady but heavy with the ghosts of that night. "I was 2 miles away, operating a surveillance drone, watching it all unfold through the cameras. When the shooting started, I had a choice: follow protocol and wait for backup, or break every rule in the book." Mitchell leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "What did you do?" Meera's eyes grew distant, as if she were no longer in the sterile room, but back in the desert, the glow of monitors illuminating her face. "I abandoned my post, took control of an armed drone that wasn't mine, and I started a war." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 1,000 decisions made in the heat of battle. "For 43 minutes, I made them think they were fighting an entire squadron instead of one drone operator. I created false radar signatures, used electronic warfare techniques that weren't supposed to exist, and turned their own communication systems against them." Thompson, unable to help himself, blurted, "How many enemy combatants?" 47 confirmed, Meera replied, her tone flat. "But that's not the point. The point is that all 12 of our people made it out alive that night. 12 families didn't have to receive folded flags. 12 soldiers got to go home." "And you?" Mitchell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Meera's hand drifted unconsciously to her side, where a jagged scar lay hidden beneath her shirt, a reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through her during the extraction. "I stayed behind to destroy the drone equipment. I couldn't let it fall into enemy hands. The compound went up just as their reinforcements arrived. Everyone assumed I died in the explosion." "But you didn't," Mitchell said, her eyes narrowing. "Local resistance found me 3 days later," Meera said, her voice tightening. "Half dead, buried under rubble. They hid me for 6 months while I recovered. When I was strong enough to contact my unit, I learned something interesting." She paused, her jaw clenching as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "The operation was officially deemed a failure. The rescued personnel were sworn to secrecy. My actions were classified beyond anyone's clearance level. And Sergeant Meera Shaw was declared killed in action, buried with full military honors." Mitchell nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "They gave you a choice. Come back to a world where I could never speak about what happened, where the most important thing I'd ever done would be erased from history, or stay dead and disappear completely." Meera's smile was bitter, tinged with the pain of a life left behind. I chose to stay dead. Martine, forgetting protocol in his curiosity, spoke up. So why are you here now? Meera reached into her jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with age and worn from countless moments of handling. She held it gently, as if it were a fragile relic. My unit commander, Captain James Rodriguez, no relation to you, Officer Rodriguez, wrote this letter before he died. He asked me to deliver it to his wife, Maria, along with his service cap. Staff Sergeant Williams, a SEAL who knew him, tracked me down and gave me the cap. I've been carrying them both ever since, waiting for the right moment. The air at the military airport checkpoint hung thick with tension, a blend of routine suspicion and unspoken histories. Meera Shaw, 27, stood tall with a soldier's bearing, her eyes shadowed by a past she kept buried. Declared dead after Operation Blue Ash 3 years prior, her decorated military record was a secret she guarded closely. Her only companion was a worn backpack, and within it, a letter that pulsed with purpose. The officers before her, Rodriguez, Martine, and Thompson, were oblivious to the storm they were about to unleash. Officer Rodriguez, the checkpoint's lead, carried the exhaustion of a man who'd processed countless faces. His voice was sharp, authoritative, as he demanded Meera's identification. Officer Martine, with a swagger born of overconfidence, rummaged through her belongings with careless hands, tossing items aside as if they held no value. Officer Thompson, young and eager to prove himself, smirked as he held up a tattered book from her bag, his mocking comments slicing through the air. Meera stood unmoved, her jaw clenched, her heart beating with disciplined restraint. She'd endured far worse than their taunts, but the weight of her mission anchored her. Then Martine's rough hands uncovered a dog tag, its metallic gleam catching the light. He held it up, squinting at the name, Meera Shaw. The room stilled. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed, skepticism battling curiosity. This says you're dead, he said, his tone teetering between disbelief and accusation. Meera met his gaze, her voice steady, edged with resolve. That's right. Meera Shaw didn't survive Operation Blue Ash. I'm just here to deliver something for a friend. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering. Meera reached into her pocket and produced a folded letter, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Captain Rodriguez didn't make it home 6 months after that mission, she said, each word deliberate, heavy with memory. Different war, different fight. Before he died, he asked me to deliver this to his wife. She held up the letter, a quiet testament to a promise kept. Maria Rodriguez lives 20 miles from here. She's been waiting 3 years for this, though she doesn't know it exists. He wrote it the night before Blue Ash, after learning she was pregnant. Silence settled over the room, not the awkward tension of before, but a reverence born of shared sacrifice. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a career officer in her 50s, rose from her chair, her sharp eyes alight with recognition, fixed on the dog tag. She knew who Meera was, not the ghost the records claimed, but a soldier of extraordinary courage. Officers Martine and Thompson, she said, her voice slicing through the quiet, you will forget everything you've heard here. Sergeant Shaw's presence is classified. This conversation never happened. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am, the two officers responded in unison, their earlier bravado replaced by a flicker of awe. Mitchell turned to Meera, her expression softening but still formal. Sergeant, I can arrange transportation to Mrs. Rodriguez's home. It would be my honor. Meera shook her head, her resolve unwavering. Thank you, Colonel, but I travel quietly. Mitchell nodded, understanding the need for solitude in a mission so personal. She picked up the dog tag and offered it to Meera. This belongs to you. Meera accepted it, slipping it back into her pocket with a faint, bittersweet smile. No, Colonel. It belongs to the Meera Shaw who died 3 years ago. I'm just carrying it for her. As Meera prepared to leave, she paused, turning to Martine and Thompson. Her voice was low, imbued with hard-earned wisdom. The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong, remember this. Sometimes the most important people are the ones you never see coming. Word of Meera's presence spread swiftly through the base's hushed channels. Within an hour, phones hummed with coded messages, and whispers of a ghost returned from the dead circulated among the ranks. Colonel Mitchell made 3 calls. The first, to her commanding officer, was cloaked in the cryptic language of military protocol. The second, to the base chaplain, prepared him for an unprecedented event. The third was to a number she hadn't dialed in 3 years, Maria Rodriguez. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mitchell began, her voice steady yet gentle. This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell from Grey Rock Air Force Base. I'm calling about your husband, Captain James Rodriguez. The silence on the other end was heavy with old grief, the kind that lingers like a bruise. Colonel, my husband died 3 years ago, Maria said, her voice trembling with cautious hope. Is there something new? Someone is coming to see you today, Mitchell replied. Someone who served with your husband. She's bringing something he wanted you to have. 2 hours later, a small convoy arrived outside the checkpoint, not an official military escort, but something more powerful. Volunteers from every branch, Marines, Air Force personnel, Army veterans, Navy SEALs, had gathered, drawn by the quiet legend of Meera Shaw. Among them was Staff Sergeant Williams, a SEAL who had known Captain Rodriguez. He stepped forward, carrying a service cap wrapped in an American flag, the same cap Rodriguez had worn during Operation Blue Ash, preserved for 3 years. Where is she? Williams asked Mitchell, his voice gruff but reverent. She left on foot, Mitchell replied, said she preferred to travel quietly. Williams nodded, his eyes scanning the road ahead. She won't get far carrying that weight alone. They found Meera 2 miles down the road, her steps steady but heavy, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The letter in her past weighed more than the pack itself. When she heard the hum of approaching vehicles, her instincts, sharpened by years of staying unseen, urged her to vanish into the shadows. But then Williams called out, Sergeant Shaw, a moment of your time. Meera stopped, turning to face the convoy. She saw the respect in their eyes, not blind adoration, but the quiet acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. Williams approached, the flag-wrapped cap in his hands. This belonged to Captain Rodriguez, he said. We thought you should be the one to deliver it. For the first time, Meera's carefully maintained composure faltered. Her hand trembled as she accepted the cap, its weight more than fabric and thread. It was a piece of a man, a mission, a life. I was just delivering a letter, she said, her voice barely audible. Ma'am, Williams replied, his tone firm yet kind. You're delivering far more than that. The service members stood at attention as Meera carefully placed the cap in her backpack alongside the letter. No words were spoken, but the silence was its own language, one of solidarity and honor. They formed a quiet escort, not crowding her but walking alongside, ensuring she wouldn't carry this burden alone. As they approached Maria Rodriguez's home, Meera felt the weight of the past 3 years settle into something new. Not lighter, but shared. The afternoon sun hung low over the modest neighborhood where Maria Rodriguez lived, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. A small crowd had gathered outside her home, not nosy neighbors peering from behind curtains, but the families of the 12 soldiers Meera Shaw had saved during the chaos of Operation Blue Ash. Their presence was quiet, reverent, like pilgrims at a shrine no one else could see. Meera stood at the threshold, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't since the battlefield, her hands clutching a worn envelope and a service cap that carried the weight of a promise kept. Maria opened the door, her face etched with the kind of grief that never fully fades. In her early 30s, she held a 3-year-old boy whose wide, curious eyes mirrored those of the man Meera had once followed into hell. Mrs. Rodriguez, Meera began, her voice soft but steady. I served with your husband, Captain Rodriguez. He asked me to bring you this. She extended the letter, her fingers trembling just enough to betray the calm she projected. Her gaze, though, lingered on the boy, his small hand clutching his mother's sleeve. Maria accepted the letter, her breath catching, but before she could find words, the child's voice cut through the silence. Mama, the pretty lady has Daddy's friend medal, he said, pointing at the dog tag glinting at Meera's collar, catching the fading light like a beacon. Maria's eyes widened, recognition dawning like a slow sunrise. You're her, she whispered, voice thick with awe. The ghost soldier, the one from the stories. You saved them all. Meera knelt to meet the boy's gaze, her knees pressing into the cold porch. What's your name, soldier? She asked, her tone gentle, but carrying the cadence of someone who'd once commanded respect. James, the boy replied, puffing out his chest with pride. Like my daddy. Meera's throat tightened. "Your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew, James. He saved so many people." The boy studied her with a seriousness that belied his age, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny American flag pin, the kind kids wear on Veterans Day. "For you," he said, pressing it into her hand, "because you brought Daddy's words home." Mira's fingers closed around the pin, and for the first time in 3 years, tears welled in her eyes, tears she'd locked away through countless nights of silence and survival. The crowd around them stood still, as if bearing witness to a moment too sacred to interrupt. This wasn't just the delivery of a letter, it was the closing of a chapter, the moment a ghost finally stepped into the light. Meera had once believed that honor was about recognition. Medals pinned to a chest, names etched on plaques, stories told to crowds. She'd thought that if no one knew what you'd done, your sacrifices somehow mattered less. But the years since Operation Blue Ash had taught her otherwise. True honor wasn't in the spotlight or the applause. It was in the quiet choices made when no one was watching, when the world had moved on and the scars remained. It was in the dog tags worn close to the heart, the faded photographs tucked into wallets, the letters carried across oceans to keep a promise. It was in living for something bigger than your own pain, even when the weight of it threatened to crush you. As Meera walked away from Maria's house, she left behind more than a letter and a cap. She left the ghost of Sergeant Meera Shaw, the woman who was supposed to be dead, whose sacrifice was buried under layers of classified reports. What she carried with her was heavier, yet somehow lighter. The knowledge that 12 families still gathered around dinner tables because of decisions she'd made in 43 minutes of unrelenting chaos. That a boy named James would grow up with his father's words, even if he'd never fully grasped the cost of their delivery. 3 weeks earlier, Meera had faced a different kind of trial at a military airport checkpoint. The security officers, Rodriguez, Martin, and Thompson, had treated her like just another civilian, their eyes blind to the warrior beneath her unassuming exterior. Officer Rodriguez, the lead, carried the wariness of someone who'd seen too much, his voice clipped and authoritative as he demanded her papers. Martin, with a swagger that bordered on arrogance, rifled through her belongings with rough hands, tossing her carefully packed items without care. Thompson, the youngest, eager to prove himself, sneered at her modest possessions, mocking the worn dog tag that hung around her neck. "Nice souvenir," he'd said, oblivious to the truth it carried. But then Colonel Sarah Mitchell had appeared, her sharp eyes catching the glint of that dog tag. In her 50s, a career officer with a presence that commanded silence, she recognized Meera instantly. Not by name, but by the weight of her story. "Stand down," she'd ordered the officers, her voice cutting through their bravado like a blade. To Meera, she offered only a nod, but it was enough, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. The security officers learned something that day, though they might not yet understand it. You can't measure a person's worth by their appearance, their silence, or their refusal to fight back. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose restraint. Sometimes the fiercest warriors are the ones who look like they've never seen a battlefield. 3 weeks after the visit to Maria's house, a package arrived for Meera. No return address, no note. Inside was a new dog tag engraved with simple words: "Shaw M. Guardian Angel, always faithful." Who sent it? It could have been Colonel Mitchell, her quiet nod carrying more weight than Meera had realized. It could have been one of the 12 families, their gratitude woven into whispered stories. Or maybe it was someone in the military grapevine, where legends travel faster than official orders. It didn't matter. The message did. Some call signs aren't earned in the spotlight, but in the shadows, where no one will ever know your name. Meera wore both tags now, one etched with her past, the other with her truth. They clinked softly against her chest, a reminder that honor isn't in being seen, but in carrying on, quietly, faithfully, long after the storm has passed. Meera Shaw moved through the military airport checkpoint with the cautious grace of someone who knew how to blend into the shadows. At 27, her sharp eyes and steady hands carried the weight of a past she kept buried. A decorated former sergeant, officially declared dead after Operation Blue Ash. Her military history was a secret she guarded fiercely, tucked away like the worn dog tag hidden beneath her shirt. She adjusted her backpack, her movements deliberate, as if each step was a calculated act of survival. The airport buzzed with the hum of travelers, but for Meera, every glance, every uniform, felt like a spotlight threatening to expose her. Officer Rodriguez, the lead security officer, stood at the checkpoint with an air of weary authority. His lined face and clipped tone suggested years of dealing with the same repetitive chaos: passports, bags, and excuses. He barely looked up from the scanner as he waved Meera forward, his voice gruff. "Bag on the belt, empty your pockets." His eyes flicked to her briefly, sizing her up, but there was no spark of recognition. To him, she was just another civilian, another face in the endless stream of travelers. But Meera felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the one that always tightened when she had to face authority. She complied silently, placing her backpack on the conveyor belt, her fingers lingering on the straps as if reluctant to let go. Officer Martin, standing nearby, handled Mira's bag with a roughness that bordered on disdain. His swagger suggested he enjoyed the power of his role a little too much. He unzipped her backpack, tossing items onto the counter with a carelessness that made Mira's jaw clench. A worn notebook, a folded jacket, a small tin of coffee. Each item felt like a piece of her carefully constructed facade being pried open. Martin smirked as he held up the tin. "Coffee? You planning a camping trip or something?" His tone was mocking, but Meera didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a calm that masked the storm inside her, the memories of desert nights and missions where that tin had been her only comfort. Officer Thompson, the youngest of the trio, was eager to prove himself. His eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm of someone new to the job, desperate to earn his place. He rifled through Mira's belongings with a performative zeal, pausing to hold up a battered paperback novel. "This yours? Didn't peg you for a reader?" he said, chuckling, as if he'd uncovered some great secret. Mira's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to tell him that book had been her lifeline during nights when the weight of her choices threatened to crush her. Instead, she said nothing, her silence a shield she'd perfected over years of hiding. As the officers continued their inspection, a glint of metal caught Martin's eye. He reached into the bag and pulled out a dog tag, its surface scratched but still legible. Mira's heart stopped. She tucked it deep in a side pocket, hidden from prying eyes. But now it dangled from Martin's fingers like a grenade with the pin pulled. "What's this?" he asked, his tone shifting from mockery to curiosity. Before Meera could answer, a new figure approached. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a career officer in her 50s whose presence commanded the room. Her uniform was crisp, her gaze sharp, and when she saw the dog tag, her expression changed. It wasn't just recognition, it was reverence. She knew who Meera was, or at least who she had been. "Let me see that," she said, her voice low but firm. Martin handed it over, and for a moment, the checkpoint seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Mitchell's fingers traced the engraved name on the tag. She didn't look at Meera, but her eyes held a weight that spoke of shared secrets, of battles fought in silence. "Carry on," she said finally, returning the tag to Meera with a nod that felt like an unspoken promise. Meera exhaled, slipping the tag back into her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly. The checkpoint faded into the background as she moved on, but the encounter lingered, a reminder of the life she could never fully escape. Her destination was a small house on the outskirts of the city where Maria Rodriguez lived with her 3-year-old son, James. Maria was the widow of Captain James Rodriguez, Meera's unit commander, a man whose leadership had shaped her in ways she could never repay. He died in the same operation that had killed Meera, and she carried his final letter and service cap like a sacred burden. The letter was creased from months of being folded and unfolded, read in moments of doubt when Meera needed to remember why she was still here. The cap, delivered to her by Staff Sergeant Williams, a SEAL who'd served with the captain, was pristine, a symbol of a man whose honor had never wavered. When Meera knocked on Maria's door, her heart pounded harder than it had at the checkpoint. Maria opened the door, her face weary but kind, her eyes carrying the quiet grief of someone who had learned to live with loss. Little James clung to her leg, his wide eyes studying Meera with innocent curiosity. Meera knelt down, offering a small smile to the boy who shared his father's name. "I have something for you," she said to Maria, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She handed over the letter and the cap, her hands lingering as if letting go would sever her last tie to the captain. Maria's fingers trembled as she took the items. She read the letter in silence, tears welling in her eyes as she traced her husband's familiar handwriting. The words were his final goodbye, a message of love and pride for the family he'd left behind. The cap, with its faded insignia, seemed to carry his presence, a tangible piece of the man who had been her world. Maria looked at Meera, her voice breaking. "You knew him?" Meera nodded, unable to speak. She wanted to tell Maria everything, about the missions, the sacrifices, the way Captain Rodriguez had believed in her when she doubted herself. But some truths were too heavy to share, so she simply said, "He was a good man." As Meera walked away from the house, the weight of the encounter settled into her bones. She thought of the dog tag, the one that declared her dead, and the one that said she was still fighting. It wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about the trust placed in her by people like Captain Rodriguez, people who would never know the lives she'd saved. Honor, she realized, wasn't about being remembered by history. It was about living faithfully, carrying the quiet legacies that changed the world in ways no one would ever see. Meera adjusted her backpack and kept walking, her silhouette fading into the dusk. A soldier who would never stop fighting, even if her battles remained unseen.